A short time ago, a good friend of mine made me aware of a contentious Twitter thread about whether or not orcs are a racist trope. This is not the first time this debate has arisen, and in fact, fantasy has been the subject of much criticism over the years, with some people seeing it as a genre of wish fulfillment for nerdy white men. To anyone who holds that view, I would encourage them to read some fantasy from the last 30 years. To give some quick examples, there's Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, which has a world with great diversity and no misogyny. Or look at N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. In her books, she does a brilliant job of portraying the consequences of oppression. Or you can go back as far as Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books back in the 70s when she was exploring her feminist vision. So actually the genre has many talented women writers and thankfully an increasing number of people of color who are writing great fantasy books. But there is a legacy to consider, and many common tropes in fantasy, like orcs, have their roots in colonialist and racist and sexist history. Fantasy as a genre was born in the 19th and early 20th century, so it would be miraculous if sexism and racism hadn't found their way into the genre. As a white man, I believe it's very important for me to struggle with these questions and issues. However, I hope that if I have the privilege of having a discussion with a woman or a person of color on this subject, that I would have the grace and the wisdom and the humility to do the vast majority of the listening. So, let's address the Oliphant in the room. Is fantasy racist and sexist? Well, first of all, I think we need to dig a little bit into what we mean by the question. Fantasy is a genre, a product of the people who write it and read it. So if the question is about those people, the people who write and read fantasy, my response is that they are probably no more racist and sexist than any other group of people. In fact, through teaching courses on fantasy and interacting with people on YouTube who are fans of fantasy, I have to say that I have found them, for the most part, generous, cordial, and really wonderful people. Though, of course, I am biased. But can good people fail to question and thus pass on cultural assumptions and tropes that are racist and sexist? I'd like to take an example, a very well-known one, and that would be J.R.R. Tolkien. First of all, I need to say that Tolkien is my hero. He is the reason I learned Old English and Old Norse. He is the reason I've been wearing this tweed jacket for the last 32 years. His books awakened my sense of wonder and imagination and put me on a path that I am still journeying on. But there has been a long-time debate about racism and sexism in his books. Clearly, Tolkien was against the extreme forms of racism in his day. In his letters, he called Hitler, for example, a ruddy little ignoramus. In 1938, when he was approached by German publishers who wanted to publish The Hobbit, and they asked him if he was Aryan, Tolkien bristled at the question and in fact declared that he would have been proud to have Jewish ancestry. He also spoke and wrote against apartheid. It would be wrong to put The Lord of the Rings on the same level as something deliberately hateful like Mein Kampf. However, I personally can no longer gloss over the swarthy Southrons and the sallow Easterlings and the orcs, whom Tolkien himself described in one of his letters, and I'm quoting here, as squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. It's pretty hard to read that for me. And It's also an indication that the orcs and other villains are lacking all complexity and serve as contrast to the white heroes of the story. I don't think there's any escaping that conclusion. There are well-intentioned rationalizations of such characterizations that might have convinced me 30 years ago. But let's be honest, such characterizations in a book written in 2020 would at the very least be seen as insensitive and would most rightly be condemned. For a white European male born in 1892, I would say that Tolkien was probably on the tolerant side. He was undeniably Eurocentric in his fiction, but as a Catholic who grew up orphaned in England, he also, I think, knew what it was to be a disempowered minority. I think he was a decent man with deep religious convictions that often led him to great honesty. But he was not immune to the common cultural assumptions of his era. I'd like to think that if somehow he could have lived longer, he might have even recognized some of the tropes he used and forwarded as having origins in racist and colonialist history. Also, there are 0 female characters in The Hobbit, and representation of women in Lord of the Rings is idealized and minimal. Now, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of this argument. It's been done, and I'm not really a fan of slapping labels on anyone unless there's an extreme case. But when women and people of color tell me that they find the representation or the lack thereof to be disturbing and hurtful, I want to have the grace and the wisdom and the humility to listen. And it really goes way beyond Tolkien. There were writers in the 80s and the 90s and even beyond using the same tropes without questioning them. My point is that good people, even geniuses like Tolkien, who clearly hated overt theories of racism and racial superiority, can fail to question the powerful and underlying assumptions of their culture and time, especially those that privilege them. People are messy and complex and contradictory and conflicted, and we can change. Ironically, that is a message that is quite prominent in Lord of the Rings. I mentioned Ursula Le Guin earlier, who was I consider a great feminist fantasy writer, but she expressed regret that her first fantasy, A Wizard of Earthsea, largely ignored women. As always in history, it takes the actions of some courageous people to challenge deep and powerful cultural assumptions. And some of us kind of totter along behind those people, often resisting such shifts in perspective. So, what now? Well, for one, I believe that fantasy needs diversity. And readers and writers of fantasy should embrace it where we find it. To my friends who still subscribe to the historical accuracy argument, I do have something to say. Let me just briefly explain the historical accuracy argument, which simply states that it doesn't make sense to portray non-white people in medieval-inspired settings because they didn't exist. And also, what's wrong with portraying sexism if that's how things were back in those times? So I know this argument pretty well because I used to believe in it. My response now is, well, it's fantasy, not historical fiction. So if you can have magic and dragons, and I'm pretty sure those aren't historical, why can't you have some black and brown, well-developed characters? Or how about a world without misogyny? And there are many non-medieval fantasy settings too, of course. But even more important, the historical accuracy argument is actually inaccurate. Scholars are increasingly finding how diverse the Middle Ages actually were. Now, were racism and misogyny part of the past? Yes, they were, of course. And it might even be important to tell stories with racism and misogyny. But if racism and sexism are part of the story, they must not go unquestioned without developing the repercussions to them, and they must never be glorified. This is especially true since fantasy of all genres most encourages the capacity to imagine that which is not. In fact, fantasy is a tool with vast potential to effect change. With its kinship to dreams and myths, fantasy is a place where people can confront their struggles. By imagining what doesn't exist, fantasy gives us new perspectives on the reality that we inhabit, and perhaps a bit of the insight and the courage that we need to make change. To those who are rightly critical of fantasy and authors like Tolkien, I would plead with you to resist labeling the person as a racist or a sexist, except in cases where you see a hardened position. Use nuance when you're examining a person, but fiercely and lovingly, if possible, call out the use of racist and sexist tropes or any other kind of discrimination where you see it. To fans of fantasy like myself, I ask you to listen with grace, wisdom, and humility when you hear such critical voices, rather than taking them as a personal attack on you or your favorite authors, or being angry at them for reducing your enjoyment of your favorite book. Those voices might just be the ones that will enrich our genre. For me personally, I especially want to pay attention to authors who are women and people of color. I have a lot to learn from them. They have visions that can offer me new perspectives. I will also continue to read my favorite white male authors, even as I learn to acknowledge the possible shortcomings in their portrayals of race and gender and culture. And I look forward to finding some new favorites. For example, maybe the next great epic series by a woman author. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join me again when I return to reviewing some of the greatest fantasy of all time in my next videos. Until next time.